Did you know at this very moment, someone is on Amazon and Etsy actively looking for a quality coloring and activity book to add to their shopping cart? The only question is, will it be yours? Since you're listening to this podcast, hence the name of the show, it's pretty safe to assume that you have a keen interest in creating and selling your first or next coloring book. And it's for that reason I want to assure you you're in the right place. And I'd like to help you make it a reality by inviting you to check out the Coloring Book Creator Mentor Program, the first of its kind complete A to Z course that features live weekly coaching, resources, templates, and an extremely supportive online community, all designed to assure that you create a standout in-demand coloring book that you'll actually enjoy creating, promoting, and selling. Imagine the feeling of knowing somewhere in the world someone is adding your beautiful new book to their shopping cart, investing in a piece of your creativity. Enrollment is open and you can get started by going to coloringbookcreatorcourse.com. That's coloringbookcreatorcourse.com. Hello and welcome to the podcast today. I'm back with another Ask Rodney edition of the podcast. This is a new feature that I'm going to be doing some episodes on because I get a lot of really great questions from my people who follow me on social media. These questions that came in this week are actually from members of my Coloring Book Creator Society community that I have. And I'll put some links in the show notes if you'd like to learn more about that. So each week in my program, I do 2 live coaching calls a week, and my members come in with questions that they have or issues that they want some support around addressing. And I felt this one in particular was a really good one for this edition of the Ask Rodney section of the podcast that I wanted to start doing more episodes on. This one of the questions that came in was from one of my students. And she said she hired a designer on Fiverr to create a book cover for her book. This was her second book project with the same person. And the first results went really great. They had a great working relationship. Everything went well. But she's not getting similar results with the second book. More specifically, the cover is where the issue is. And so she addressed this with me and shared the files with me. And there's clearly some discrepancy in color matching and things of that nature, which is, to me, as a person with I'm a photographer as well, and I've done tons of editing using software tools like Photoshop and Lightroom. I've also spent many years as a web designer and setting up websites and blogs and opt-in pages and you name it, and creating graphics in Canva. So I've got a very extensive background in everything as far as digital assets, the creative assets, artwork, covers, and things of that nature. So the minute she brought this to my attention, I looked at the cover and it was clear that the colors between the front and the back of the same book, mind you, there was clearly a discrepancy between the colors were not matching. She brought it to my attention. I looked at the file, I looked at what she received, and what has happened since the first project, moving on to the second project, that there seems to be some kind of an issue going on between the designer and my member, where the person that she's hired on Fiverr is basically not wanting to make any adjustments to the file because I guess in the person's mind is that the files were accepted as far as the transaction. When you hire someone on Fiverr, you're allowed so many revisions, you allow so many opportunities to look at the work that they're delivering to you and then sign off on it and what have you. Now, because I wasn't involved in that part of the conversation, I can't really speak to it. So what I'm going to talk about, because I feel like this is very important to really get some clarity around it, and for you as a person who could potentially be hiring outside support people to do things for you, like create graphics, book covers, and pages and so forth for your book projects. So the first thing, I'm going to speak to this as a provider, someone who has those same skills myself, and then as the customer. So as the provider, it is imperative, whether you're selling on Fiverr or through your own website or whatever you're doing, It's very important that you state written out on your site or wherever doing the transaction how many revisions a client is allowed before it moves into having to basically pay for additional time or services. So in other words, if you allow one revision, two revisions, three revisions, unlimited revisions, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's the fact that it's written out somewhere on your page or your listing, if you're on Upwork, Fiverr, or again on your own website, you must clearly state how many revisions a client is allowed before it then moves into the client having to pay additional money to retain additional services. If you don't state that anywhere, first of all, it's not good form to do that. If you are doing work for hire and you understand that a client is going to have revision requests, I'm not saying I would never recommend that anyone offer unlimited revision requests because they could go into perpetuity. So you do need to put a cap on it, but I would be very clear in what that is. Is it 1, 2, 3 revisions or whatever? With that being said, let's say if you offer 2 revisions, but they sign off on it after 1, technically, once they sign off, you could then require that they have to pay additional monies to go back in and revise, because when I say signed off on it, they basically looked at the file and they've agreed that it's what they want and they're basically okaying it, then your work is completed. If they come back and go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't look closely enough, I missed that, you can go one or two ways with it. Clearly, your terms of service state that once you sign off on it, there's no additional revisions without additional monies. And you can state that in your policy, that that's what it is. Now, I'm going to put a caveat onto that. If this is a client that you've worked with, and in the case of my member, that they already worked together once on a project and they were very happy with their relationship, then something along the way between the first book and the second book, things kind of went differently. And so now when revisions are being asked, and in my opinion, because I'm going to switch over to from the customer side in a moment, looking at the file that I reviewed, for me, it was very clear that there was an issue. So what I'm going to say in this particular situation, my eye is more trained to pick up on the details of things with a file because it's what I've done myself for so many years. For someone who doesn't know this or doesn't understand or whatever the situation may be, you could be excited behind what you saw and you felt like, oh, this looks great, and you sign off on it. But then upon further examination, you start to realize that, oh, wait a minute, actually the color is off. This is not really, actually it doesn't really match. Like in the beginning, and again, you have to also keep in mind as well, when you're looking at things on a screen, everyone's computers are all different makes, models, years, types. The average person that is not a designer, say a graphic designer or a photographer, their screen is not color calibrated. So that's going to impact the way that things are displayed. Perhaps for my member, that the way the cover looked to her on her computer might have looked a certain way. But then when the file was shared with me and I'm looking at it at the level in which I work with graphics, and also because my eye is trained to look very closely at the details of things, to me, it was glaring what the issues were. So my mind is going back to then the designer, because it was so obvious. I'm thinking to myself, how could you not see that the front and the back don't match? Basically, when you upload a book file, it's one file for the front and the back of the book with a spine in the middle. And when I'm looking at the file, I can clearly see that none of the colors in the back match the cover on the front. And again, it's not like it's two separate files. This is one file with both elements in one design. I wasn't quite understanding what this designer could not see about that. So when my client went back, as I said, you need to go back to her and have her color match this. Her response back to me was the person didn't want to do it. And so I'm thinking, without being charged, without her paying additional money. So then this segues back to the beginning of this conversation. How many revisions are you allowed before it moves over into having to pay additional monies? Now, again, this part I didn't ask my student, so I don't know for certain what the arrangement was in regards to terms of service between her and the person she hired. So what I'm going to say here is, if my student signed off on it when she received it, or she didn't understand that I'm only allowed one revision, any additional revisions I have to pay for, if that is the issue, then it is the client's responsibility to read the terms of service and understand that I'm allowed these many revisions before it then moves into I have to pay additional money. So I'm going to open this up for two potential possibilities. One could be that my student didn't understand that you're not allowed more than one or two revisions. Again, and I don't know. I don't know how many revisions were asked for before it went into possibly when I saw the file and suggested it go back to the designer to be corrected. I don't know at that point if they had already signed off on the number of revisions that already had been done up to that point, and then any additional revisions was going to then move into being required to pay additional money. So let's say someone on Fiverr or Upwork or anybody, it doesn't have to be those two platforms. I'm not picking on Fiverr or Upwork. First of all, find out how many revisions you're allowed before the order is considered completed. Once you get the first bit of work back, really go through it. And if you're looking at it on a small screen, like on a phone or something like that, move it to a larger monitor. Move it to like a laptop or a desktop monitor where you can really open the file up and really look at it. And don't be afraid to magnify it so that you can really see the details, because again, the details is where a lot of things get missed. Don't let your excitement overshadow your ability to scrutinize what you've received. So when you get the first draft, then you go back in with your revisions, and no designer, I don't care if it's web, graphic, whatever, no one wants to be in an endless loop of revisions. No one wants that. It's not time efficient for the person that's doing the work. Ultimately, the responsibility falls on the client in that respect. You got to scrutinize the work. You've got to look at it. You've got to make sure it's what you wanted. And so when you come back in for that next round of updates or revisions, you're clearly stating what you asked for and what you need. And be very clear and succinct in what you're requesting. So really go through it. Go through the file and make sure that you're picking up everything. Now, will there be a chance that you might miss something? Yes, possibly. But again, don't be so fast to want to send the order back over to the person that you hired. Take a little bit of time. Now, you don't take a week or whatever, but take a day or so to really look at the file. Depending upon what they've done and the magnitude of the work, it shouldn't take you long to do it. But again, don't try to look at the original file on a phone or something like that. The screen is too small. You need to be on a bigger monitor so you can really see exactly what was done. Then again, before you hire, make sure you understand how many revisions you're allowed before it moves into being charged additional money. Because again, that's your responsibility to read that. And also, I will take it to the the provider side and say, it's also your responsibility to tell the client how many revisions they're allowed. If you're going to charge additional money for revisions past 1 or 2 revisions, especially if it's 1 revision, you need to make sure that you clearly state that so that the client doesn't feel like, well, I missed it or forgot to ask for it, now I'm stuck with it. And if that's the case, the responsibility does fall on the client, the person doing the hiring, to come back and say, what, you're right, I missed that. And then you pay the additional money for the revision and you keep it moving. Let me also state something here. I would not hire anyone that didn't allow me any revisions at all. That's just not, for this type of work, that's just not good business. I would not do that. I would not tell someone, well, when I do it once, I'm done and you pay me and we move on. If you want something more, you have to pay for it. You should at least allow your client 1 revision, possibly 2. I wouldn't go more than that. Because again, it falls to the responsibility of the client that they look at what you deliver so they understand what they've got, and then the conversation is much more clearer. So communication and again, it can be challenging when you're going through some of these online services like a Fiverr or an Upwork where you're not actually talking to them on the phone or on Zoom. Everything is done through messaging and chat. And that in and of itself can open up the possibility for miscommunication because you're writing your perspective on things and they're responding from their perspective on things. And especially if your provider is possibly where English is not their first language, that also could be open up the possibility of there being communication mishaps. Again, I always say to all of my Coloring Book Creators members, if you're going to go to a site like a Fiverr or an Upwork, go hire someone for a test job to see just what they do and how, and not only what they deliver, but how they communicate. Because you must be able to be on the same page, even if there is a language, I don't want to say a barrier, but again, the way native-born English-speaking people, I'll say Americans and say people in the UK and what have you, Australia, the way that we communicate things and the way other countries communicate things could be not construed the same way. You have to be able to understand who you're communicating with and make sure that when you give them the first draft of the job to do, that you're very clear and succinct in what you're expecting. Clearly, write out everything you're looking for, even if you worked with that person before. Now, this is where it kind of gets a little tricky because, again, there was a prior working relationship. The first time they were together, everything went swimmingly. So something happened in the communication between job number 1 and job number 2, and that I don't know what that exactly is. I can't speak to it. But no matter, regardless, the bottom line is that communication must be established, expectations must be clearly outlined. And when you get the first draft files, it is your responsibility as the person doing the hiring to take your time and go through what was delivered so that you can make sure that when you go back for a revision request, that you're clearly stating what you're looking for that wasn't delivered in the first draft. And not from an accusatory position where you are essentially saying to them that you messed up and didn't do this and didn't do that. That's not the position and the energy you want to come from. You want your relationship to be with someone that you're hiring to do services for you to be, yes, you are the client, you are the one paying for the service, but you also must keep the relationship respectful, and you must be able to work with the person from a partnership perspective. Now, I'm again not saying that any harsh words were exchanged or an attitude was part of the whole transaction. I don't know. But what I can say is the more diplomatic you can be in your requests for additional revisions, the more mindful and thoughtful of how you're asking for things and requesting things and pointing out things that are not exactly what you expected or wanted is going to go a long way towards that person feeling ownership, which they should anyway, because you're paying them for the work, but to feel ownership for what they're doing, and more to the point, wanting to make sure that you're comfortable with the job they're delivering, because not only will they come back for additional projects they want to hire you for, I'm now speaking from the perspective of being the provider, but the referrals that you can get. Now, always try to keep the first round or so resolving an issue between yourself and a provider or yourself and a client in a very, always try to keep the tone professional, just going to go a long way towards establishing that relationship or partnership. If you trying that, and I'm speaking as the person doing the hiring, not the provider, you've read the terms of service, you understand what your responsibility was, what their responsibility was. If you realize that, because things get missed, we don't always read everything on a page. So if you see that provider's terms of service is that you're allowed one revision after you sign off on it, and you must pay for additional revisions, that is the agreement that you made when you submitted the order and paid for it. That's a part of your agreement. If you didn't read that or understand that, then yes, it is your responsibility as the person doing the hiring that because that provider can hold you to that. If you're allowed one revision, you got that revision, you signed off on it and said you're okay with it, and then you come back after further examination, I noticed this, and this. Technically, if you signed off on it and paid for it and you said you're okay with it, that provider can turn around and say, that's fine. You have to then pay for additional revisions. And they have that right to request that of you. So again, make sure as the person doing the hiring that you're understanding what you're paying for and what you're getting. That's the first thing. From the provider perspective, you're the one being hired to do the work. Make sure that you stated what your requirements are, what your terms of service are. Make sure that you stated that you're allowed one revision, two revisions, and after that, then you get charged this amount of money. Clearly state if there's a time frame on how long it takes them to get back to you with those revision requests. Clearly state that. So all of that must be written on you. Where I don't care where you're offering your services to, that must be clearly stated on your page or on your website or whatever you're doing, even in the agreement that you make. If it's done, maybe you write up something on a website or you write up a PDF document that you send off to the client and have them e-sign. Those kinds of things always protect the client and protect you. Because we're creatives, we can tend to be, and I'm just going to be a little blunt here, but we can tend to be a little sloppy because we're all excited about the work that we get to do and we're getting paid to do something that we enjoy. And we're just going to focus on the creative and the art part of things, but we're dropping the ball on the business part of things. If you don't have clear agreements that you are going to deliver and what you're expecting from the client and what the client can expect from you, you're already behind the eight ball. I would say write up some kind of an agreement that you have that person sign off on before you start work together so everyone understands. And nothing communicates that better than check boxes. If you're allowed one revision, two revisions, they check off on that box. That is basically their, of course, they have to sign it too, but that's their understanding that you're going to allow them X number of revisions before then you start charging them. What is that number? How much are you charging them? And then what can they expect for turnaround? It would help tremendously if you provide that client when they first hire you, what things you need from them in order for you to be able to execute the job. When I used to design websites for clients years ago, I was very clear because In the very beginning, I was excited to get the job and I didn't have agreements and I was grateful for the business. And then I found myself being in a position of what I call herding cats. I'm having to ask repeatedly for images. I'm having to ask repeatedly for copy that I needed. I'm having to ask repeatedly for all these elements I needed to build the site. And I would have one client in particular that took her months to get me the materials that I needed. It went so long, actually it was more than that, it was almost a year. And it went so long, I had forgotten what I even needed anymore. So again, and then that also needs to be stated too. Is there a time limit as to how long that you're going to be on quote unquote retainer? From a provider perspective, that's my responsibility to communicate what I'm expecting from you as the client. And with that being said, I want to say this as well. Do not let your excitement for getting the job overcloud you running your business, because it is a business. You're transacting between yourself and that person, and communication is going to make everything go smoothly because you're working on multiple projects. If you need to implement hard deadlines or when things are to be delivered, then that's what needs to happen. And anything that falls outside of that, then whatever your rules are for handling that must be stated. What I will say is, having done those kinds of services for many years, I had to learn that through trial and error. So anything that a client did that I didn't communicate because I didn't know to communicate it, or whatever happened, I would then start adding those experiences into my terms of service. So if I had a client that was dragging out about getting me materials, I had to put that into my terms of service. When you sign up and make your deposit, this is expected on this date and time, this date and time, this date and time, and clearly state it out. I personally cannot speak to the workflow of Fiverr because I have never offered services on Fiverr. I've hired people on Fiverr, but I've not been on the other side of that as a provider. So again, to wrap the plane on this whole, land the plane, I should say, on this whole conversation here is, again, communicate clearly what you're looking for. If you're doing the hiring, communicate clearly what you're looking for. Make sure you understand terms of service between yourself and that provider. When you get first draft of your work that you hired from that provider, examine it very closely. Do not rely on a small handheld device to look at files. Look at that on a larger computer. If you have any questions and you're still not sure, or you still want to make sure you didn't miss anything, maybe get a second set of eyes on it, because a lot of times we're too close to it because it's our project. And sometimes in our excitement to see something, we're not really scrutinizing what we're getting. So having a second fresh set of eyes that can look at things that you may have completely missed in your excitement and say, oh, I noticed this and this, this, and this. Then you can go, oh yeah, no, I missed that. So when you go back in for your first set of revisions, if you're allowed more than one, then you state out exactly what you found, what you noticed, and what you need to have corrected moving forward. And that's going to circumvent right there probably 95 or more % of any discrepancy issues that you could have between yourself and the provider. So that's my recommendation for that. As far as if you now on Fiverr, I did do some research, and there are some protections as the person doing the hiring that you have if there's disputes. I'm not going to go into all the details in this episode of the podcast. I'm just going to put the links to the resources that I found inside the show notes of some things I found when I did my own research on what you can do. I know there is a window of time. If you are really not happy with the work that you received, there is a window of time where you can file a support ticket, and Fiverr will then get involved. And I'm speaking specifically about Fiverr. Will get involved and perhaps in some respects become like the go-between or the mediator between yourself and the provider. and work out whatever needs to get worked out. So I'm not going to say anything to the effect of paying and get a refund or anything of that nature, because again, I've been on both sides of this. And so I don't want to always say that the person on Fiverr is not ethical and so on and so forth. I'm not even remotely suggesting that, because I do know, as someone who's been hired by clients, that the client itself shoulders some responsibility in regards to how they communicate. I want to make sure that I'm speaking from both sides of this conversation. I'll provide some links to some show notes and things in there that you can look at if you decide or need to move forward in some kind of way. If there's clearly things that you requested that did not get delivered and perhaps you paid for it already, there are some steps that you can take to safeguard yourself. I'll just put those links in the show notes. That's what I have for you for this episode of Ask Rodney. I appreciate you listening, and I also appreciate you sharing your experiences with me. I'm always looking for new topics of different things I can offer for this segment, because I like this. I like getting in there and finding out what's going on and seeing how I can support you. If you have any questions you want to ask me, I can't promise I'm going to address everything, but if I feel like it's a good question that a large amount of my listeners would enjoy hearing from, I will definitely address it on future episodes of the Ask Rodney section of the podcast. I provided links in the show notes in order for you to be able to submit your question to me. You can do it on Instagram and or Facebook. The links are at the bottom. And lastly, before I wrap it up, I am going to place this video. I actually recorded this as a video as well as an audio podcast. So I'm going to put the video iteration of this on YouTube. So if you'd like to go check it out over there, I'm trying to start putting some more things on YouTube. I'd love for you to check it out there. I'll also put the links and the show notes in that as well. And the last thing I will ask you is, if you're listening to this on the podcast, whether it's Spotify, Apple, iTunes, whatever the case may be, I would love it if you would consider rating and reviewing the podcast episode. Again, those rates and reviews help get more people's eyes on it and more ears on it, and I would greatly appreciate it. So with that said, I thank you so much for your time and listening. Check out all the resources, links in the show notes. And again, if you're interested in learning more about the coloring book creators community and society that I have, it's a group membership community where I work with individuals who want to create coloring books, journals. I'm even expanding into workbooks and planners. And if you'd like support, not only in developing these products, but also marketing and selling these products, I would love to have you in the society. So if you're interested in that, there's a link in the show notes for you to be able to check that out and join. It's a very comprehensive program. Again, the cornerstone of it is the live coaching. Like most online courses and things like that, you get a ton of videos, and there are some videos and things like that for you lesson-wise. But the cornerstone of everything is the live coaching, which I do twice a week. And you can come in and ask any questions that you have. If I don't have it addressed, I will address it and make a video about it. I enjoy doing this. I love working with people who are trying to get their vision out in the world. I think that what some might label as low content books, I think is a great starter business idea. I think it's a great complement to other types of things that you do. So if you are an author, say, of a self-help book, or a book on finance, a book on health, a book on fitness, or that kind of thing, workbooks and even coloring books and activity books can be as an awesome complement to your written book. So if you're interested in creating something to complement your already published book, do reach out to me. You can also reach out to me through Facebook or through Instagram. If you're not necessarily wanting to be in a course program, but you want some support more on a done with you experience, working with me directly, do reach out to me via Instagram and or Facebook and say, hey, I have a book, Rodney. I'd like to create a complimentary book to go with that book. I'd like to talk to you about that. And I will reach out to you and we'll have a conversation about it. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Stay tuned for future episodes of the Ask Rodney segment of the podcast. And I look forward to connecting with you on future shows. All right. Take care of yourself.